Okay. So today we are going to talk about Microsoft SQL Server. Before going to that detail, we will talk about first that what we covered yesterday. So yesterday, first of all, we covered about data. First of all, we learned what data is. After that, we talked about databases. After that, we talked about database management system. And then after that, we talked about ER diagram, right? So these are the four things that we talked about yesterday. When we were talking about ER diagram, at that point, we were also talking about the different type of relationships that each of the entities can have. That means we talked about one-to-one relationship, we talked about one-to-many relationship, we talked about many-to-one relationship, and then also many-to-many relationship, right? Today, one of the things that we are going to talk about is the Microsoft SQL Server, the various releases, the various history, the various things which are included in Microsoft SQL Server. That is what we are going to cover today. And this is just like a conceptual class. It's not like where we are going to write queries and all. So this is how it is going to like be for the first three classes. After the three classes, we'll have the query session started, and that's when you need to have the SQL Server also installed in your system. But don't worry about that. What I'll do is that I will also send you the instruction. I'll send you a video how to get that installed. So that would all also be covered as part of the sessions. Now let's talk about SQL Server. So Microsoft SQL Server is a relational database management system developed by Microsoft. It is a software product whose primary function is to store and retrieve data as requested by other software applications. So that means that SQL Server is a relational database management system which has been developed by Microsoft. Why do we call it as a relational database management system rather than a database management system? Because everything here comes as a relation. When there are multiple tables in the database, there would be some relations between each of these tables. And that's why this is known as a relational database management system. And that is also one of the difference between the uh, uh, between the other thing, or you must be hearing about big data, NoSQL and all, right? In that we don't have relations and all. But here in the relational database management system like Microsoft SQL Server, PostgreSQL, MySQL, Oracle, we have relations and all, right? So now also it is a primary product. It is a software product whose primary function is to store and retrieve data. What does it means is that you either insert the data, right? Or you also select the data. That is what you do as part of the this database management system. Let's talk about the different release history of SQL Server. So the first version of SQL Server, it came in 1989. So as you can see that it has a very, very long history. That means this is a product which is more than 20 years old. And that's why we have people who just know end to end of SQL Server. Even I'm using it for more than a decade now. So currently we are in version 15, right? So currently one of the recent version of SQL Server was SQL Server 2019. That was the release. And that is what is known as the version 15. Since the release of SQL Server 2000, advances have been made in performance, the client IDE tools. So there has been many advances that has been made after the SQL Server 2000 was released, right? So that was a benchmark release, you can see. Now let's go back to SQL Server. Let's go and identify that what is the how to find out the version, how to find what is the server on which you are working on. So there are different type of commands that are there in SQL Server. Now anything that comes with double at the rate symbol, if you see here, this is having the double at the rate symbol, right? So this anything that comes with this double at the rate, that means that is actually being provided by SQL Server, that is already been provided by Microsoft. And that query would actually, you can say that this is a system type of query, right, through which you can find out something. So the first query that you see, which is select at the rate server name, That is actually, that would tell you about the details of the server on which you are working right now. The second query would tell you about the version. The other way to find the version is actually, if you see any server here, which is on premise, if you see just adjacent to that, it's written clearly SQL Server 15.0.2.2080, right? So 15 is the major version, and then the other things that are there, that is talking about the minor version. So we'll not worry about the minor version, but just the major version. So right now I'm using SQL Server 15, which is SQL Server 2019 version. So I can just, as I run this query, suppose that select at the rate version, I can just copy and I can just paste it here just to see what are the different information that we have here. So what I see here is that this is the 2019 version, right? And which is 15.0, and it was released in November 6, 2020. That's when it came here. And then I the edition that I'm using. So there are multiple things here. One is the version that we just talked about. Then we have the edition as well of SQL Server. I'll talk about that as well. So we have the Express edition, we have the developer edition, then we have the enterprise edition, then we have the web edition. These are the four editions that are there. What we have to do is that we have to install the developer edition, which I'm using also, right? And then the last thing is talking about the Windows 10 and all. Many of you will not have the Windows system, right? Though SQL Server is supported well by the Windows system, but if you don't have the Windows system, in that case also I'll help you to get installed on Mac, etc. Right? So I'll send you the details of how can you get installed on Mac if you don't have a Windows system, right? Let's go back now. Let's also talk about the advantages that has been uh, came since SQL over 2005. Now, as part of this syllabus, we are not just going to cover SQL Server, but we are going to talk about the other tools as well. That means we are going to cover the whole BI as well. So SQL Server or Microsoft SQL Server since 2005, it actually brought this BI thing in its library. That means before 2005, there was no support for BI and all. So in 2005, the first tool that Microsoft introduced was the Extract, Transform, Load, or the ETL tool, which is also known as SSIS, or the SQL Server Integration Services, right? So that tool is actually used to extract the data, then transform it, and then load it somewhere else. So we'll be talking in detail, we'll be doing all the practices, and you become a pro of the uh, SSIS as well after the end of this whole journey. The second one is the reporting server, which is actually talking about SSRS, SQL Server Reporting Services. So that was also introduced in SQL Server 2005. The third one is the OLAP, or the data mining server, that which is also known as the analysis services, online analytical processing. That is the meaning of this one, right? So this comes under SSAS. So we are going to talk about all of this in detail. We are going to do all the queries, everything, all the practices about all this. We are going to become a pro on all of this. So this is what all things that came after 2005. There were other features that were also released. That means the messaging technologies, the service broker, the notification services, etc. Those are came after 2005. Now talking about the different editions, as I was just talking about that in the previous, when I was covering the select at the rate server name and select at the rate version, at that time I talked about the editions as well, right? So we have four mainstream editions of SQL Server. First is the enterprise edition. In the enterprise edition, you have all the features. And when you'd be working in a company, right, when you'd be going and working in organization, most of the organization, they will actually have this version of SQL Server installed, right? So enterprise edition is the edition which has all the features of SQL Server. And then comes the standard edition. The standard edition has most of the features except the high availability features. That means there are some features through which you can do the replication in real time and other stuff. Those features could not be there while all other features should be there in the standard edition. Next comes the Express edition. Express edition has limited features, right? But it is actually it is just for, suppose that you want to try SQL Server, or you want to install smaller databases and use it on your own. That is when you use the Express edition. So Express edition is used for that. Next is the Developer edition. So Developer edition, it was not there since long. It just came into picture just 1-2 versions before, but that is actually specifically built for developer. It has most of the features, right, that are required, and is well suited for any developer. So we'll be either installing the Express edition, which is also free, or the Developer edition. You can install any one of them. My preference is always to go for the Developer edition because it doesn't have the limit of having 10 GB database per database, right? 10 GB of storage per database. So we'll go with the Developer edition. As part of the installation, I'll send you all the details from where to install, how to install, and all. Don't worry about that because we are going to do the queries and all after the third class. Next is the services. So while you see this machine as just one single entity, there are lots of services that are also running in the background of this machine. So SQL Server is a very powerful tool. It does a lot of work together, and that's why we have a lot of services also running in the background. So the first service is the SQL Server engine, which is the core of everything that we do. If engine is not there, you won't be able to do the querying and you won't be able to retrieve the data. So that is one of the main services of Microsoft SQL Server. Then comes the agent. SQL Server agent is used for running jobs, etc. Right? So we'd be also talking about that what are jobs and all later point on time. But as of now, just understand that anything that you want to run on scheduled time or something, for that you create the jobs. And SQL Server agent is the service which is used in that case. And then after that, also we have a lot of services. We talked about integration services, reporting services, analysis services. Other than that, we have SQL Server browser and SQL Server full text search services, right? So these are the different services, and it's not just that. There are other services as well, but these are, we are just trying to focus on the main services that are part of SQL Server, right? So this is just for information. It's not very uh, uh, thing like you have to remember all this. That is not required. This is just for your information, that if someone asks like what is the main service, then you should be able to tell SQL Server engine. Now the next thing is the system databases in SQL Server. So as we are proceeding with our journey in SQL Server, one of the important things that we should know, that when we install SQL Server, what are the database that would be installed with the version of SQL Server that will install. So for that, it's important for us to understand what are the system databases in SQL Server. So when we talk about system databases, we have 5 databases in SQL Server. The first one is the master, second one is MSDB, third is model, fourth is TempDB, and fifth is resource DB, which was introduced in SQL Server 2005. Right? So these are the various system databases in SQL Server. Let's also show you where these all are present. So when you go to the server, when you install your server, once you will open that, after that you'll see a databases tab. Inside the databases tab, you'll see all these databases, right? Inside that, there is a folder known as system databases. If you expand that folder, you will see different databases. So you see here 4 different databases: master, model, MSDB, and TempDB. Now, one of the database that actually I was mentioning is the resource DB, which is missing here. Why it is missing? It's not like that it's dependent on version and all. It would be there, but it is always hidden. You can't see that database by default because that contains very such information that if you try to manipulate that, even your SQL server can become corrupted. So normally that's why Microsoft keeps it hidden, because that database is very useful when you are migrating from one edition or one version of SQL Server to different version. For example, right now you are in SQL Server 2016 and you want to migrate to SQL Server 2019. If that is the scenario, then this resource DB comes into picture. So let's talk about all these different type of databases that we have, and then we'll go further from that. So the first one in this is the master database. What is the purpose of master database? Master database, it records all system level information for a SQL Server instance. This includes instance-wide metadata such as login accounts, endpoints, link servers, and system configuration settings. It also records the existence of all other databases and location of these database files, and records the initialization of information for SQL Server. SQL Server cannot start if the master database is unavailable. So as the name suggests, this is one of the most important databases in terms of system databases. And if master database is not available, your SQL Server would not be able to start. So this is that important. And anything that is going inside the SQL Server, anything that you are actually doing, that is actually stored inside the master database. How can I say that? So later on, we'll be talking about the schema and other stuff, but I'll just show you example. For example, if I run this query, select second, select start from this dot database. If I run this query, what you see here is the name of the different database, right? So this all information is actually stored in the master database. Anything that is coming with the sys schema is actually there inside the master database, and which is getting copied into other database. For example, I want to understand what the different tables. So I have this sys dot table. So all whatever thing is going on inside the SQL Server, that is being stored inside the master database. Also, what are the different login accounts? What are the different link server? What are the different system configuration settings? We are going to talk about all these terms later on in future in detail. But as of now, just understand that all the master information is stored in the master DB. It also records the existence of all other databases and location of those database files, and records the initialization information of SQL Server. So when we create any database and all, so that is actually um, what we are doing there is that we are doing a logical thing, right? For example, I'll create a database named batch 266 for your batch to do all the practice. So that is just a logical thing. What happens is that in that case, the database is actually created physically as well, in that case, and that is getting stored somewhere in your hard disk, because again, this is a local server, right? You are not this is something that you are creating locally in your system.
Mm.
Can you go on mute?
So,
Next comes the MSDB database. MSDB database is used by SQL Server agent for scheduling alerts and jobs. It is used by service broker and database mail as well. By default, MSDB uses the simple recovery model. So MSDB database is the other database which is used by Microsoft SQL Server. It is used for by the SQL Server agent for scheduling alerts and jobs. As I was talking about that, you can run the jobs and all also by using uh, the SQL Server. So for that, we have this database, the MSDB database, which is used there. Next comes the model database. The model database is used as a template for all the databases created on an instance of SQL Server. Because TempDB is created every time SQL Server is started, the model database must always exist on a SQL Server system. When a create database statement is issued, the first part of the database is created by copying the contents of the model database. So what does it means? Basically, suppose that I use this term. I want to create a new database here. Create database, and then name of the database. For example, batch 266. Right. So whenever I issue any such statement, what will happen is that whatever things are existing inside this model database, those would be copied, and that's how the structure of the database would be created. So for example, in my company, like I want whenever a new database is created, some of the objects should be there. So what I can do is that I can create those objects inside the model database. And whenever new database would be created, then that database would have that information already present. So this is the purpose of the model database. Next comes the resource database. As I was saying that this is a read-only database that contains all the system objects that are included with SQL Server. SQL Server system objects such as sys.objects are physically persisted in the resource database, but they logically appear in the sys schema of every database. The resource database does not contain user data or user metadata. The resource database makes upgrading to a new version of SQL Server easier and faster procedure. As I was talking about that suppose that you want to migrate from SQL Server 2016 to 2019, this is the database that is useful here. Earlier, the migration process was very painful. It was very hard to migrate from one version of SQL Server to another version of SQL Server. But now with the help of resource database, that is an easier procedure. The last but not the least is the TempDB database. So the TempDB database, it's actually recreated every time you restart the server. That means suppose that I have this server which is running in the background right now. If I restart this server, this particular server, what will happen? This database will be recreated again. So TempDB is actually used to do all the operations. For example, you are creating some temporary objects that is stored in the TempDB, or you are just doing some calculations and all that happens inside the TempDB. So basically, it's a global resource that all the databases uses. So that is the purpose of the TempDB database. In whatever you are doing inside the TempDB, that is not logged, right? That is minimally logged. So again, that means that you don't have record of what is going on inside the TempDB. Also, TempDB is recreated every time SQL Server is started, so that SQL system always starts with a clean copy of the database. So as I was mentioning, whenever you restart the SQL Server, the TempDB would be recreated every time. Next comes the database files and file group. What we have learned so far in today's class is that, first of all, we talked about the SQL Server history, we talked about the versions, we talked about the different type of objects are there. After that, we talked about so after that, we talked about the master databases in SQL Server. Now we are going to talk about database files and file groups. So let's try to understand what is a file, what is a file group, right? At the minimum, every SQL Server database has two operating system files. One, a data file, second, a log file. Data file contains data and objects such as tables, indexes, store procedures, and views. Log file contains the information that is required to recover all transactions in the database. Right? So there are two types of files normally in any database. There can be more than two as well, right? But at the minimum, there has to be two files. One is the data file and one is the log file. Now, suppose that I have lots of database here. What if I want to see that how many files are there for this database? So I can just right click on this database. I can go inside the properties. Now the properties window is opening. In that there are various tabs. The second tab is actually the file tab. This is what we are talking about right now. So you can see that there are two files right here. The file type, if you see, the first one is the data file, second is the log file, and then also there are other configurations as well. And then this is the path where actually in my system this is stored. So this file is stored here, this file is also stored there. What you will see is that there's some difference in the names of these two files. That's how we identify. And also there's difference in also the extension or the suffix of this file. We'll talk about that as well. So data file contains data in objects such as tables, index, store procedures, and views, while the log files, it will contain the information that is required to recover all transactions in the database. For example, when you are running insert statement, delete a statement, update a statement, those all informations that when you ran something like this and all, that all information goes inside the log file. So with that, there are three types of files. One is the primary data file, second is the secondary data file, and third is the transaction log file. The secondary data file is actually optional, while the primary data file and the log file is actually are the two mandatory files. Talking about the primary data file contains the startup information for the database. User data and objects can be stored in this file or in secondary data files. Every database has one primary data file. The recommended file name extension for primary data file is .mdf, right? So this is the recommended file name extension for the primary data file, but this is not mandatory, right? So what is this .mdf means is that through that you can just identify that this is the primary data file. This is something which is containing the data. That's all. What if you want to keep, you can just keep another extension as well. But actually everywhere, wherever you'll go, wherever you are, all the companies in the world or everyone actually follows the same naming convention. That's why it's better to give this the extension .mdf. So anything that you see with .mdf extension, you can understand that this is the data file, and also more specifically this is a primary data file, and it is having all the data that we are doing inside the SQL Server. Whatever the tables we have created, whatever the views we have created, all that information is inside this .mdf or the primary data file. Next is the secondary data file, which can be there or which can't be there. So depending upon the size of the database or the configuration, there can be one or more data files, right? If there's more than one data file, then there will be definitely a secondary data file, because when there are more data files, you have to tell that which one is the primary data file, and then after that, any other data file would be the secondary data file. It also contains the same information as the primary data file. It will contain the different objects and all, right? But the only thing is that there can be just one primary data file, and that's why the other data files are known as the secondary data file. So when do you need the secondary data file? Because Windows had a limit of the maximum size of a single object, right? So when that limit exceeds, then you definitely need this secondary data file. Because when we go about databases, there's no limit on the amount of data that can come. It can goes in terabytes, and then it can go with megabytes and things like that, right? And that's why when the a single size of file actually exceeds, then in that case you'll need another data file, which is the secondary data file. Again, the recommended file extension for the secondary data file is .ndf, right? So this is what the normally we use as the suffix of this secondary data file .ndf. So the primary was .mdf, this is .ndf. And the third is the transaction log file. So transaction log file would just hold the log information that is used to recover the database. There must be at least one log file for each database. The recommended file name extension for transaction log is .ldf. So uh, this is the extension that we use for the transaction log file. This should just contain the log information. For example, any DML statement. So we'll talk about DML, DDL later on, but as of now, just understand that suppose that you are inserting the data, that is a DML statement. You are updating the data, that is DML statement. You are deleting the record. All that thing goes inside the transaction log file. But again, there's a thing here that will also depend on the recovery model of your database. Now, what is the recovery model here? We'll talk about that again later on. But depending upon various configurations, either the information will go inside the transaction log file or it will not go, right? So we'll talk about that in future once we'll talk about the various recovery model, but that is not very far. We'll talk about that very soon, right? But as of now, just understand that the log information goes inside the transaction log file, which has the extension .ldf. Now we just talked about the files. What is file group? Every database has a primary file group. So this comes by default with the database, right? So in the database, you don't need to create a file group in order to create other objects. So what you'll see that there's already one default file group which comes with the installation of that database, and the name of the file group is the primary file group. The file group contains the primary data file and any secondary file that are put into other file group. So actually file group is nothing but its collection of different data files. That is what the file group is. I was just talking about the files where we talked about the primary data file, the secondary data file, and so on. So all that information that we talked about, primary data file, secondary file, that is actually stored inside the file group. So a file group can contain multiple files, right? And then you can create multiple file groups as well. One of the advanced concept of databases is partitioning. When we'll talk about partitioning, one of the things that we'll be doing is that we'll be creating different file groups. That means we'll be separating the data into different file groups, and that's how actually it will make SQL Server easier to get the data. When you have a lot of data, what you can do is that you can uh, just think it like that. For example, you are somewhere based in Canada, right? And then there are lots of streets over there. These streets are there because if suppose that there would be no street, there would be just one place, just the city name, right? And then in the city name, you have maybe millions of houses. Would that be easier in that case to find out a house when you are looking for, or it is easier now when what you have done is that you have actually separated out different streets? So now you have divided the city into different streets. In that street you have given the name of the houses. So instead of searching for millions of houses, you have to just search into thousands of houses to get a particular house, right? And that is what the file group is. So file group is just like dividing that thing logically and then storing it physically. That is what we do, and that's how we try to get the information faster. That is the purpose of the file. I hope that is clear. So as I was saying, by default, there is a file group named as the primary file group, which contains the primary data file. All system tables are allocated to the primary file group. So any system table that is there, that will also be allocated or that will be stored in the primary file group. And you can create as many as file group as is required. If I have to show you where is the file group information stored, I can just again right click on the database, go to properties. Inside that, there's a tab called file. Here you can see that there's just one file group, which is the default, right? And the name is the primary file group. So this just came by default. I can add more file group if I want, but as of now, we are not going to do that. So as the other thing is the user defined file group. So any file group that you are creating as a user, that is the user defined file, right? So you can create your own file groups as well, and then you can store data in order to get that data faster. So if you want to change the default file group, you can use the alter database statement. The primary file group is the default file group but unless it is changed by using the alter database statement, allocation for the system objects and the table remains within the file group, not the new default file. So even if you change your default file group, the system objects will still be stored in the primary file group, because that is how SQL Server stores it. The primary file group is the default file group unless it is changed by using the alter database state, right? So this is all about file and file group. For the first three classes, I'd be going very slowly, right? After that, because when you start doing queries, the classes will go for 1 hour. But as of now, for the first three classes, it will go just for 45 minutes. So there's a reason why I'm doing that, because again, because you are just starting your learning procedure. So I want you to give some time to grasp things and all. I don't want you to actually put a lot of stuff at the same time. Otherwise, it will just become overheated and you won't be able to understand a lot of things. So let's, before going or ending the class, let's first talk about what we learned today, right? We started with talking about SQL Server or Microsoft SQL Server. We talked about the versions. We talked about releases. We talked about edition, right? And which edition you need to install. After that, we talked about the various features or the services, right? Then we talked about the files, and we in files we talked about the different type of files like primary data file. Then we talked about secondary data file. We also talked about the transaction log file, right? And then after that, we talked about file groups and how they hold files together, right? These are the different things that we talked about today. So I hope that you were able to understand all of this. If anyone has any question, we can just I can try to answer that right now, because from my side, today's is this is what I want to cover for today, and tomorrow we'll begin with the new topic. But as of now, this is all I wanted you to know. And the other thing also I wanted to mention, you don't need to remember all this, right? This is very conceptual, and once you start doing practices and other things, right, these things will come into your mind at that time only, right? So you don't need to remember all of this.